I'm going to share something on the screen. We've referenced some things around a stretch and comfort and challenge. There's a theory that we use in adventure education called the challenge zones. I'm going to show you an image. What I hope for you to be able to do when you see this is maybe confirm some of it and maybe critique some of it.
Sure.
From your perspective. So you should be able to see this now.
Yeah.
So this is very common in the industry. It gets used a lot. It's somewhat shifted now to sort of have this comfort zone lower down on the circle because it used to sit centralized. The idea was that people are not, their tolerance from creeping from comfort to panic might not be as large as others, right? So there's some range there. As you look at this, what are you, from your perspective, seeing that you agree with, and what are you seeing that you maybe are not agreeing with?
I agree with it in principle. I might change the juxtaposition between familiar and comfort. What might be familiar might not be comfortable. I might be familiar with an abusive relationship, might be familiar, but it's not very comfortable. And yet, we are so drawn to familiarity that will avoid the stretch zone, will avoid the panic zone. Ironically, in that instance, is to not be in the abusive relationship. In other words, it's to be in a place that's not familiar. So we have this terrible phrase, which is the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. It's just another devil. It's just a familiar one. You have no idea if it's better or worse. It could be better, but you have no idea. So we actually just call uncertainty the devil, right? So familiarity is comfortable in some sense, but it can actually objectively be uncomfortable. I would also have this be contextual, because some things that are stretches for one person might not be stretches for another. But also, we are not the same person. So understanding your contextuality is really to truly understand yourself. So there might be aspects in your life where the comfort zone is tiny, and so much of that is a stretch zone or a panic zone, or the green section is really small and the blue goes right to the red, right? And there might be other situations where, whoa, that panic zone is way out there and there's a big stretch zone and things like that. So, for loving relationships, if they're avoidant attachment, fearful attachment strategies, that panic zone there might be no stretch zone. I just go straight to panic. But if I'm an open, etc., I might not have a panic zone. It's just that the dynamics actually are matter, and actually understanding oneself might be understanding the relationships between those. And also, they're not a fine boundary. It's more of a gradation and an overlap, I would suggest. And also, one thing can affect another thing. Our brains are parallel. There are lots of things going on. So, for instance, it could be that if you're in a playful context, suddenly the stretch zone becomes the boundary, or the desire to be in the stretch zone might be greater, or that some of that stuff that's in the panic zone might become part of the green zone. But if I'm in a high stress situation where people are shouting and all that, suddenly what was in the green zone jumps up into the red zone. We forget how the context is so essential. And that's where culture comes in. That could be a culture within oneself, within one's friendships or romantic relationships or a business.
It's why I think there's, we talk about, we want to try to form connections before we get to connection before content, because once you form some connections, you have changed the cultural experience, you've changed the dynamics by which you then enter into an experience that could lead someone to panic. The difference between me doing it with people I know versus people who are strangers to me, the likelihood of me taking risks is probably diminished if I'm with people I don't know and I'm familiar with.
You can't play if you don't feel safe. You can't play if you don't have structure. And so often with businesses, businesses are often designed to be efficient. A great way to maximize efficiency is through competition, right? It's a really crap way to maximize creativity, right? So what they'll do is they say, can you help us be creative? It's like, no, you're of a culture of competition where no one's going to ask a question in this culture, right? No one's going to reveal vulnerability, but you want to be creative? But creativity requires not knowing stuff. And admitting that you don't want, and be excited that you don't know stuff. But you reward everybody for knowing, but you're asking them to not know, so you can't do it, right? To your point, you need an environment, a culture, but cultures can't be created. Cultures emerge from the way people interact. And the one who gives permission for the way they're going to interact is the person leading it, is you. You're the host in your context, parents, leaders. It requires everybody, but the one who's saying, who has the most connections and the most influence is often, not always, the person who's leading it.
It's my role and others' role to try to ensure that we're having stretch without panic. We're trying to have growth without the negativity. Yeah. And that's a lot to consider, right? There's a lot of work that I have to think about.
That's true. And it begins with self-awareness. It begins with self-honesty, not self-truth. So often people say, well, this is my truth. Yes, but your truth could be pathological, right? I'll give you an example. If you're anxious, coming back to anxious attachment, if you're anxious attachment strategy, then your truth is, my truth is that people leave me, but your honesty is that I'm part of the process of pushing people away. Right? They're not the same thing. When I can actually do something about when I can't, or the way I do it is about controlling. So it begins, I think it's essential for people like yourself, for leaders, to better understand who you are, because you're bringing that into the context. And it's not that you need to let that go, but in order to have agency with that, you need to be aware of it, because you don't have a choice until you know you have one. Agency requires a number of things, one of which is awareness. No. What's also the powerful thing about that awareness, like for instance with your daughter, is so often as parents we'll then project our fears, which feels right to us, onto our children. And now we'll say, you know what, let's not do that. So we can project our fears and construct the actual emotional response to a fear into someone who never actually had the response themselves.
How quick can that occur? From a simple statement that someone might make,
Sure.
Or is it repetition over time?
Oh. Both. It really depends on the significance.
A student with a role model teacher, as an example, if the teacher comes and says, oh, this looks really scary.
Yeah.
The impact that could have.
Yeah. Depending on the state of the child and what their context is and how they hear that. But it can absolutely be a one-off, one-shot learning. We have one-shot learning. Wow. Or it could actually happen over time. And then what can happen is, I'll give you an example. If someone's anxious and you present them with a neutral face, okay, so everything you're doing right now, all your perceptions are grounded in your history. Okay. The history of what? And it's the history of not of what something turned out to be. It's the history of your past perceptions. So if you're feeling anxious or an anxious person, and I present you with a neutral face, a face that everyone else in the world would say, that's neutral. It's neither positive or negative, happy or sad. The anxious person will nonetheless be biased towards seeing it as threatening. So they'll elicit a threat response to that. They'll feel threatened, which means they'll behave towards that person as if they're threatening. When they see that person or someone similar, they'll then behave towards that person in the future as if they're threatening. Now that person might think, God, what's going on? Phil, I'm not threatening at all, but I might behave towards you as I stand back. And then I'll be thinking, yeah, see, I knew it. I knew he was threatening. Right? Now I've confirmed what my history of past perceptions, because I was looking for it. We also know in terms of initial exposure to people, first impressions, if we first met and I was a bit of an idiot, and then the next 9 times I was lovely, the 10th time you say, yeah, but he's just trying to manipulate me. He's this, that, or the other. You'd be interpreting the positive in the context of the very initial experience of the negative. If, however, I was very positive in the beginning, first meeting, and the next 9 times I was a bit of a jerk, and that 10th meeting, you'd be like, yeah, he's probably having a hard day. Things like that, right? You're still going to interpret the subsequent experiences according to the first one. So it can happen very quickly. And then that response becomes the history from which our brain looks back and determines the meaning of that future stimulus according to how I behaved towards it in the past. So everything you're doing right now is constructing a future history. You are shaping what you're going to do in the future by what you do now.
One other question, but I just want to bring back to something I know that there's a connection to. My daughter is in a circus troupe.
Brilliant.
She here in Vermont, in Brattleboro, Vermont, where I live, there is the New England Center for Circus Arts. And I see in the work that I do and also what she does, this incredible growth as a parent watching her learn and grow in an environment where risk is a component to the work. I know that you spent a lot of time working with Cirque du Soleil and you studied the people watching them and the response to that. When you saw those performers performing and you saw those people watching them, what is happening in their brains that is common to what I might experience in my work?
From the instructor's point of view or the people taking the risk themselves?
People taking the risk themselves.
Well, first of all, one of the things that I think we sometimes bring Cirque du Soleil performers into my talks and we create performances. And one of the one of the metaphors we use is exactly that, where you have hand-to-hand movement or dancing, where usually the man's throwing the woman into the air and then he's catching her and things like that. And we often think that, oh my goodness, she's having to trust him. So I think trust is a huge component of these types of experiences. But what's interesting is actually the trust in that context is mutual, in that he has to trust that she's going to fall in the right way, that she's not going to suddenly panic and he won't be able to catch her. So she has to trust that he's going to catch her. She has to trust that he's going to catch her, but he has to also trust that she's going to fall in a way that enables him to catch her.
Yeah.
Which is actually a really interesting thought when thinking about risk. That risk often is shared, but also sometimes when people think I'm taking the risk, but in fact what they're doing is imposing a risk on someone else. Someone who has an affair, for instance, thinks that they're taking the risk. Actually, they're putting the other person at risk because they're the one who's going to probably be hurt by it. So they're risking the emotional state of the other person through their behavior, but they perceive themselves as taking the risk. So it's interesting to think about in those environments, who's actually taking the risk. And trust is fundamental to that relationship in the risk taking. And sometimes we might take a risk that jeopardizes someone else or could do, and then making the implicit explicit, say, I'm taking this, but I appreciate in me doing this, it's actually increasing your, I want to acknowledge that. And are you okay with that?
One of the things that we also do when we're about to, if I'm teaching someone how to belay and someone's about to climb, let's say we've got the rope attached to the two, and you think that the climber is about to go up, is asking the climber, what level of support do you want from us? And asking the question rather than assuming the answer. In the same way that, like, we're talking about trust and risk, rather than assuming the answer, asking the question and filling in the gap for us. Because some people want to feel cheered and supported. Some people don't want anyone to watch.
That's
and
right.
I think that we don't ask enough of those questions. What does those things look like to you? What does risk look like to you? What does support look like to you? What does trust look like to you? And what we do is we transpose what we believe into their heads.
That's right. That's why I say the greatest leaders are the greatest listeners. The greatest speakers are actually listening to their audience. You're listening to the people that you're leading to try to figure that out, because you want to understand them, and you do want them to be in that zone that's in between the panic and you want to expand that so that the panic zone diminishes and the familiar, comfortable zone expands and the boundary in between. But in order to do that, you need to understand who and what that is for each person, as opposed to applying a general, which traditional education does. It's like, here's the average. Everyone gets educated according to that thing.
Yeah, correct. Before we wrap up this conversation, I want to touch on, you mentioned something briefly about this concept of being evolvable. And the first step in that process of growth is that awareness that you need to continue to grow and learn. You have a new publication coming out called Being Evolvable. You also had evolvable.me, which people can access already, some personality tests, relationship tests. So I've clicked through those. I'd love if you could just describe the synopsis of what that publication is about and what the hope is with something like Be Evolvable.
Yeah. So becoming evolvable, the point is that the world changes. Those who respond well to change do well in life. What does it mean to evolve? It's not to stand still. It's not to change with change, nor is it even to grow. It's to evolve. And to evolve is to increase your diversity, but also what so often is forgotten is the integration across that diversity. That's what evolution, that's what learning is. When you learn a principle, you're finding the integration across what appears diverse. That's physics. That's E equals MC squared, right? It's finding the principle that unites across diversity. And so that's to expand, to complexify yourself. And the challenge, though, is that you can't evolve if you're not first evolvable. How you respond is fundamental, and you need to actually want to change and understand how to change in order to change. So you have to be changeable in order to change. So you have to be evolvable in order to evolve. And so the book is about effectively that story. And that how you evolve being evolved is how you enter every moment, and how to change how you enter can literally transform your life immediately and sustainably. And then it goes into the principles of how we should enter, because some ways of entering are simply better than others. And so I give 10 ways in which you should enter. They're grounded in the ways that your brain evolved to evolve itself. So that's what the book is about. And then practicing that in conflict is the place where we can always practice it. So that's when someone wants to become evolvable. So when you're evolvable, when you actually want to do the thing, because so often people have all the language, they say, oh, I know this, that, or the other, but they don't actually do the thing. They don't actually do the work. They look all around except for the thing that they should be looking at. But once you're in that place where you know, I'm going to do this thing, then you need a guide. You need something that helps you, supports you in that process. It gives you agency in your own evolution. And that's why we created evolvable.me. So it's an AI platform that actually supports you and gives you agency. And it begins with understanding, who am I? Not my truth, but my honesty. And so it gives you scientific-based games, assessments, etc. And then you can sit with a guide or a coach to get better insight into what that actually means and how that's impacting your life. And you can upload your relationship WhatsApp messages, and it can give you deep insight into who you are with other people. And then we have a final guide that brings it all together that supports you in your own evolution. So it's probably the most extensive self-awareness platform available at the moment. It's for free, but also it doesn't stop there. It actually starts there with then, now who are we going to become? This is who you are. Who do we want to become? And let's support you in that process of becoming that. Because we're constantly becoming. We're never one thing and there's no destination, right? We can constantly be expanding ourselves. And so it supports you in that process to celebrate what you're doing. You're not only empowering people to be uncertain, you are actually creating the certainty from which they can step into uncertainty. You're not asking them, just tread water. Just don't be in uncertainty all the time. That'd be exhausting. But you're saying, like with I call it being a sandbar. You're a sandbar. I say to my kids, I'm not your boat. I'm your sandbar because you love swimming. I'm going to let you swim, but you're going to get tired and you can come back here and rest, and then you can swim again and then come back. And so eventually you're going to swim to the other side. You're the sandbar for other people, right?
Well,
you're empowering them to actually step onto the boat, to go swim and strengthen themselves through their own swimming, but they can come back to you. So you're not just enabling them to be uncertainty, but you're providing that space for them to come back to. You're the certainty from which they step. And that's what the brilliant leaderships and teachers and mentors do. So well done.
Thank you, Beau. I will add, I did the Path of Curiosity assessment on evolvable.me. And as an adventure educator, I was particularly low in adventurousness. So I had some own awareness of stepping into my own comfort there. But I'm excited to delve into it more. I'm going to encourage everyone listening to check out evolvable.me. I will put the link into the description, and then you'll be alerted as well if you go to see when the publication comes out.
In a couple months.
This is going to be one of those moments where I'm going to really advertise a book that I haven't read, but based on everything I have talked to you, I guarantee it's going to be a great read and super aligned with the work that I'm doing. So
brilliant.
Once again, Beau, thanks for this. This has been a real treat.
Thanks, Phil. I've enjoyed it. Cheers.